So let's talk about banding, also known as contouring or step contouring. This is something that plagues our industry. If you work with documentary footage, or if you're doing restoration or color with material that's been compressed, highly compressed through multiple generations, or it was poorly compressed to begin with, or even if you're working with 8-bit cameras that tried to record a log format, you oftentimes will see this contouring, and it's awful. It's almost impossible to get good keys. You know, the debanding tool in DaVinci Resolve and some other plugins that you can spend a lot of money on, they just never really fix the problem. And there's always these temporal ghosting artifacts. Anyway, I've never really been happy. My only workaround up to this point has been taking a very large, or as large of a sample as I can in neat video. Of course, if it's a gradient, it's, you know, your luma and your chroma values are not good enough for a neat video sample, so then that's problematic. But I've often used neat video where I can to smooth out those gradients and remove some of those blocking or those polygons that you can see in the banding, and then apply a thin layer of grain or noise over the top of it just to kind of dust it and hide my tracks. But that's not really, I've never really been happy with that. So I wanted to see if there was a more sophisticated method of debanding source material in Vapoursynth. I did a little digging and I discovered something called VS-Placebo. And the results, well, I'll just let them speak for themselves in this video, but I'm really happy. I'm going to show you how I wrote my script, but it's not going to be super nerdy, geeky in the weeds. I'm not a coder. I'm a vibe coder. I use large language models to tweak and build my code base and my scripts. So I'm going to show you just very, very briefly on how I did that, and then I'm going to take you through DaVinci Resolve to compare the results. So what is banding? It's basically whenever you compress video and you're using a lower bit depth like 8-bit or 10-bit, you have fewer numbers of code levels or tonalities that you're able to represent between a light and a dark. This is why gradients typically show up in sunsets like dawn or dusk shots, or when there's a very smooth gradation between light or dark of one part of the picture to another. You have a limited number of code levels. For example, in 8-bit, you have 256 code levels. In 10-bit, you have 1024. And in 12-bit, you have 4096. So the higher the bit depth, the higher the color precision, the more steps you can record. And all of a sudden, these big chunky contours, these steps start to get smaller and smaller and more refined until eventually they disappear. One of the limitations with digital formats is that we are limited by how much information we're able to store practically, right? It would be great to record everything on our iPhone in like 48-bit, right? But then you would have trillions or quadrillion of colors. And the file size would be so huge, you wouldn't even be able to store it in Amazon Cloud. So we try and throw away and compress as much information out of an image as far as we can before the human eye starts to notice it, so that we can keep our file sizes small, practical, efficient. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we represent something like a sky or a gradient very smoothly and beautifully. But, you know, for example, this clip, this has been overly quantized. It's probably been compressed a few times. So how do we deal with the abrupt transition between one quantized contour and the next? This is why it's so visible, right? It's those huge steps from one to the next. They're also, of course, in a polygonal shape, because that's the way the video compression works. And so when we quantize down and we only have a few bits to work with, we get these abrupt changes, and these borders are what makes everything so visible. There's no smooth transition between one contour to the next. Back in the 70s, there were some algorithms that had been invented to address this problem. And it's in some ways, it's not so different from printing. Newspapers or magazines, you have a limited amount of ability to represent the infinite tonalities that exist in a gradation from light to dark. So you had to somehow compress that information. So that's where we get dithering. And dithering is basically taking a little bit of one tone and then adding it into the next tone, and then so on and so forth. So you kind of mix the two tones that are discretized together in order to form an apparent smooth transition from one contour to the next. So let's take this example of this beautiful cat. Okay, let's say this is the original high resolution image, and then it goes through multiple rounds of compression, and now we're left with all these horrible contours. notice how these contours are not so different from the contours in our blue sky, right? What if we were able to take a little bit of this tone and a little bit of that tone, and then we had a little bit of a party in between so that we mix those two together and we smooth out that transition? It's not going to be as high resolution as the original, and we're not going to be able to get some of that detail back, like the whiskers and the hair, but at least it will give the apparent representation of the original image. So this is a Floyd-Steinberg dithering that's been applied to this same image, to this heavily contoured image, but we're using a little bit of diffusion to mix the two layers together. And sometimes there's a little bit of color as well that's spread into the contours. So this is certainly better than the posterized image. It's, of course, in video, a lot of these dots, this dither would be alive, it would be moving. So it would have an even greater impact on the moving image than it would a still image. So this is the method that I want to use. I decided to use an error diffusion model in Vapoursynth using Floyd-Steinberg dithering to smooth out the transition between each of those discretized contours and marry those contours a little bit more smoothly to give the apparent increase in quality. So that's what we're going to do today with Vapoursynth. So I'm going to quickly take you through my process of building a little application like this. I've built a number of these for different videos on my channel, but I've never actually explained how I do it. I'm not a coder by trade or a software developer. I'm a vibe coder. I use large language models to help me build out my scripts. I'm pretty familiar with Vapoursynth and I'm somewhat familiar with Python, but I'm kind of a dingus when it comes to coding. I'm not a professional, but this works for me, and I use it all the time in my work. So, I'll let the results speak for themselves. Again, typically what I'll do is I'll speak with my Claude Opus 4, the best model, the high resolution, the super smart model. I'll tell Claude exactly what I want, and I ask it to build out a detailed design requirements document for the application. I read the design requirements document, the first draft, and I provide notes, and then we go through multiple revisions. And then once I land on a design requirements document that nails it, that's what I'll hand over to another agent that runs locally to then build the application locally. So in this program, I wanted to keep it very simple, right? Simplicity is elegance. I wanted to provide separation of concerns, a very small code base. I didn't want a huge code base or a bunch of complex scripts or anything like that. I wanted just a pipeline script, a processing script, and that was it. But Claude had recommended keeping making an FFmpeg script separately so that I could at least tweak and change those settings separately. So I ended up with 3 scripts total for this program. I call it Dithery-Do. And basically what its purpose is to upsample the bit depth as well as the chroma subsampling, and then provide a very sophisticated dithering method to then smooth out those hard transitions between the discretized contours. My pipeline script, the reason I do a pipeline script is because I can do all the logging and debugging, the directory management. It's also the primary configuration for the user. So it has, multiple modes. I can turn on and off certain features. The processing.vpy file, this is my Vapoursynth file. That allows me to do all of my separate processing in steps, and I'll show you that script in a second. And then, of course, FFmpeg is just the final output. Very simple file structure. I didn't want this to be overly complex, again. So in my configuration section of my pipeline, we have an input path, an output path, and we also, if we want to do batch processing, we can input our input directory for the batches if you have a large number of files. But typically with this terribly contoured videos, it's usually one-offs, or there's maybe just a few clips that you want to process. So that's why I made this batch option and not just a single file option. The test mode is really important when you're building these scripts, because this allows you to just process a few frames at a time rather than processing the entire source file. So you can just spot check and make sure that your processing is doing what it's supposed to do, instead of sitting around for 2 hours waiting for a massive video file to process. And I also wanted to keep it very simple, true false. I wanted toggles. I wanted to be able to just turn features on and off. Very, very simple, right? So batch processing, no, I don't want that. False, turn it off. Do I want to process all the subdirectories in a batch directory? False. I have 4 different options for our output. We have a couple ProRes options and a couple of FFV1 options with 10-bit, 12-bit, or even 16-bit with ProRes, which is totally overkill when you're coming from an 8-bit file, but sometimes in the processing chain, you may want 4x4 16-bit. I also added the feature to use NVIDIA GPU. Well, I'm using VS-Placebo, which is a Vapoursynth plugin for dithering and upsampling your bit depth. And this is, it requires a GPU. And I don't know what the GPU requirements would be for a Mac OS system, but for Windows or Linux, you can certainly utilize NVIDIA GPU for the plugin. And that also helps speed things up. For the dithering algorithm that we've already discussed, Floyd-Steinberg, I feel like that's given me the best results so far. And for the logging level, we can set that to various depths. If you wanted to set it to debug, to output much more information, to debug specific problems, or to monitor the process as it goes, that's also an excellent option. Okay, let's run Dithering and see if we can get some good results. So I love running btop while I'm running my custom scripts, because then I can see if I'm utilizing all of my resources on my computer, and it looks like I'm pretty much maxed out. I don't really have much room for anything else. I'm also running OBS and DaVinci Resolve and Chrome with a bunch of tabs, and my system seems to be handling it just fine. So as we can see here, VS-Placebo was detected and available. I have a couple of fallbacks, including Neo F3 KDB. In case VS-Placebo is not working. That's if you happen to go to my GitHub page, you want to test this software tool out, and you don't have the ability to run VS-Placebo, then Neo F3 KDB is a nice fallback, although it's not as sophisticated, so you won't get as good as results. As we can see here, plugin status Placebo is true, and we've got our GPU enabled. Debanding is enabled, and the debanding strength is maximum. I'm not using test mode right now. We're going to be processing all 12,000 frames, because I'm going to bring this into Resolve to show you the different results of those different scenes. And so it's, again, it says here applied VS-Placebo debanding maximum strength. So progress reporting is important, and that's another reason why I love using a pipeline script, because it kind of manages everything. The Vapoursynth script is doing the processing work, but the pipeline script is kind of managing it, right? It's kind of providing the debugging and all the terminal outputs and the updates, and also the progress bar. And so those two, the Vapoursynth script and the pipeline script, are talking to each other and providing me progress updates. And this is great, because if I'm processing a massive file, I don't want to sit around and not know when it's going to be finished. I want to know, like, how many frames per second am I getting in processing? Definitely getting faster than real time, and almost twice as real time, because the source file is 30 FPS. So we're almost 60% done already. So I'm going to go ahead and let this continue processing, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, Dithering processing has finished successfully. So let's double check this is the right folder. Here we are. This is our new clip that we've processed. Everything looks good. Great. Okay, now we're in DaVinci Resolve. I've dropped in our newly dithered and processed file into video track 2 called Dithering, and video track 1 is the source, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and play the source for you so you can see these contours again in action. So they sparkle. They're really, really horrible. It's awful. And then I'll turn on the Dithering version, and you can see a lot of those contours have gone. Now, one thing that I always like to make sure of is that I'm not decimating detail whenever I'm applying the dither, when I'm doing the color and bit depth upsample. And I'll show you later that we're not decimating the detail. We're essentially just processing those contour lines. So there's a before and an after. And for this clip here, remember, this is the one that had the static contours. I'm going to zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. This is the original. Just really awful. And here we are with the new dithered version. That's awesome. So just quickly, I wanted to show you that even when we apply this process to our media, we don't actually lose any detail. So I'm zoomed way in on this image here, as you can see. I'm going to zoom way in. And I'm going to toggle. This is the original source, and then this is the new debanded material. I'll zoom in even more so you can see. You can see that all of the bands over here, it's harder to notice because I've taken the break off the color grade that I put on to put the contours in relief. But if I zoom in, you can see this texture here. It's broken up now with a little bit of a soft grain. It's really lovely. There's no loss in detail at all. There's no edge loss. Let me zoom into one of the brighter areas, which tend to show a little bit more detail. Let me turn this off. Turn this back on. That's the original source. This is the new version. You see what I mean? It's not touching the detail of the original clip. Here's our candle shot. I'm going to zoom in right into the edge here. You can see this is the original source, and this is the new debanded material. Original source, debanded material. There's no loss in quality. There's no loss in detail whatsoever. You would think that these amorphous shapes, yet it's another cloud. You would think that these would somehow, that this algorithm would decimate this detail, because amorphous shapes like this that have erratic movement are hard to predict, right? But that's not really how this model works. And again, here's the shot that is heavily quantized. I've taken the color grade off that puts those contours in relief, but you can see them right here. This is a heavily contoured image. I'm going to zoom right in on the moon there. Right in. I have so many shots of the moon. Not sure why. Turning. This is the new debanded source. Let me just do that one more time so you can see. I'm going to turn it off. This is the original source. This is the new debanded material. Original source. Debanded material. There's no loss in quality. There's no loss in detail. We don't decimate anything. Now you might think that this looks odd, and the reason is because I've applied a filter over the top of this, which I call break, which is just a really high contrast, you know, artificially destroyed image. But what it does is it brings out the contours in pure relief so you can see them. If we were to use the original, it would look something like this, as you can see. So again, the contours, it's hard to see them. They're hard to make out because they're so dark. But if I were to zoom in, or if I were to do any sort of color grading on this image, you would start to see the contours in relief. It's the same with this clip here as well. This is the original. They're much harder to see. But as soon as you start pushing exposure and saturation, you start adding contrast back into this image, you'll start to see those contours. So break is very handy. It's just it's basically a lot of contrast and saturation, increasing the exposure of the clip. I'm going to put that break back on so we can tell the difference between the two and do our analysis. It's a much smoother gradation. And if we zoom in a little bit more, we can see the dramatic difference between the two. The new version that's dithered is still going to sparkle, right? We started with such massive polygons and contours that it's really hard to get rid of all of that without decimating detail. But I would argue that this is a much better version of our original image. And when I start trying to pull keys on something like this, you start to notice a huge difference in the fidelity between the older contoured image and the newer dithered image. Lastly, I just wanted to show you one of my favorite benefits to debanding the footage in this more sophisticated way. If you are a colorist, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anytime you try and key heavily contoured source material, it's nearly impossible. It just creates a lot of work for you. It's not a very nice key, especially if it's skin tones or a sky. The whole thing just falls apart. So I'm going to show you. This is the original with those heavy contours, and this is the newly banded material. Here's the sky. We have these massive contour bands running right through the middle of the sky, and here we are. We've smoothed those out. It's much more organic. In fact, let me show you what this looks like. I'll play it for you. Look at these contours. It's awful. And here we are. This is so much more organic. We still get a little bit of the shift in polygons and fuzziness, but man, what a hell of a difference. This here, we can see these bands running right to the middle of our image diagonally. And here we are, we've smoothed those contours out quite a bit. And we haven't decimated any detail. This is the static, I'll show you. This is the static image of the candle where we had all the static contours, right? Totally dead. Totally dead. Trying to pull a key from that would be totally bizarre. And here we are. We've added a little bit more life into the static contours and smoothed those contours out a lot. You're going to be getting better keys, cleaner keys and transitions. This is the moonlit cloud. You can see these big chunky polygons morphing and sparkling all over the place. And here we are. This is the newly debanded material. So I hope you see the benefits to taking a little bit of extra time to use a more sophisticated method of mitigating these contours, reducing their apparent strength in the image, and also adding a very sophisticated dithering method during the bit depth upsample. This is a hell of a difference, and I'm definitely going to be using this method moving into the future. Okay guys, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you learned something. I love Vapoursynth so much, and I hope that I'm encouraging you guys to utilize Vapoursynth more in your post workflow, because the flexibility, it's like a Swiss Army knife of video processing. So it's a lot of fun to learn, and I'm learning as I'm making these videos, so it's a learning process for me as well. So if you learned something, you like this sort of content, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.